we could get
even
up
if you
to a
wanted
certain
to.
point, but then it's like, well, we're gonna win a couple battles. We're gonna lose the war. Yeah, I mean, what are we seeing with TikTok? There seems to be an uptick, no pun intended, of discussions around it, right? You've got the the FCC chair, or one of the FCC commissioners, sorry, not the chair, one of the FCC commissioners coming out and taking issue with it, outlining it as a national security threat. You have the FBI director, Christopher Wray, coming out stating something, and I can only believe that a man in that position to say something publicly is going to say it because he has information that backs up that type of a, as a credible threat. You've got both Republican and Democratic senators coming out saying, "Hey, this is a real concern. We need to do something about it." Former president, love him or hate him, right? Tried to ban TikTok, wanted to make moves on that. Nothing came of it. But so you got a lot of people across the aisle, different agencies, all sitting around going, "This is a real concern for the United States. What do we do about it?" My real question is not how many more people are going to come out and say it's a problem, but like realistically, what's the U.S. actually going to be able to go do?
Yeah. And what's the U.S. capable of doing?
Right.
It's interesting. Something that always kind of struck me, and is kind of why I wrote, kind of one of the reasons I wanted to write that kind of covert influence article, that Laura and I kind of did together a little bit ago, is, I think people don't realize how unusual the United States is in a lot of really key ways, that I think lead us to this problem to some extent. And number one, the First Amendment. The First Amendment is unusual. It's an unusual thing to have an overriding law that doesn't let a state do a lot of what a lot of states do. Germany has bans on hate speech, and they enforce those bans. They're very serious about those bans. And here in the United States, we're like, well, that's insane. We would never do that here. Like hate speech in public. A buddy of mine, a cop, Andy, was in Germany when he was right out of college, and there were a bunch of neo-Nazis in the square demonstrating. And I'm like, yeah, okay, like that's, everyone has a right to do that. And the police showed up with batons and just walked through and just like broke everybody's knees with the batons. It's like, whoa, it's like, it's not like the United States. Like it's different. The different have different norms, different rules. And the other key piece is we have no Official Secrets Act. Like in the UK, if someone leaks something to the Globe, or the Telegraph, it's illegal for them to publish like classified documents. And of course, in the United States, with the Pentagon Papers, and then the whole deep throat of it all, we went to the Supreme Court, and it was very clear that the U.S. newspapers have a right to publish classified information, and there's nothing that the government can do to stop them. I, as a government employee, as a former CIA officer, have an obligation, under my responsibilities as an employee. Brian, as a former Pentagon employee, we have obligations placed on us because special trust was placed on us. If we leak classified information that we had access to, we face consequences. But the reporter that we leak it to, who then leaks that information, in the newspaper, there's nothing, they can't be touched legally. And that is unusual. Like most other English-speaking countries, most other Western developed countries, it's not that way. Secrets, everyone has an obligation to keep state secrets. Another really key difference that's unusual about the United States is we're one of the only countries that does not have an internal security service, which is to say an internal intelligence service. So, we have our CIA, which is an external facing intelligence service. They learn about foreign threats or what other countries are doing targeting the U.S. But Canada, the United Kingdom, other English-speaking countries, you have SIS in the UK, which is like the out-facing intelligence service, and you have THESIS, which is the internal-facing intelligence service, which dealt with things like the Irish Troubles, right? When you have domestic terrorism, they're not law enforcement, they're intelligence, and you cannot be both a law enforcement agency and an intelligence agency because the incentives and the rules are completely different. Intelligence is basically rumor. Law enforcement has to be admissible in court, and intelligence, by definition, is not going to be admissible in court. So you need different people doing different things. The FBI likes to call themselves an intelligence agency, but they're not. They're not really.
Yeah.
You can't you get promoted for putting people in jail, and intelligence, by its nature, you can't put people in jail for a crime they haven't done yet. And intelligence is all about finding out things that haven't been done yet. So, like the January 6th insurgency, everyone's talking about, like, well, why didn't someone stop that? Literally, it is no one's job in the United States government to try and find out about something like that before it happens and to stop it from happening. And I think a lot of people were surprised to learn that that was the case. But we do not have a domestic intelligence service.
Sure.
And this is one of the consequences. One of the other wacky things about this, the combination of these two things together, is we were talking about kind of Cold War era propaganda and intelligence service propaganda. And I was actually talking to a colleague. I was talking to a colleague who was on part of the Biden administration. And I said, something we used to talk about at CIA, but I was curious about is, if Russia or China wanted to launch a $1 trillion advertising campaign, like a soft money pack, basically, in the United States to support one side or the other, or manipulate elections in one way or another, as long as they registered with the State Department as a foreign agent, legally, there's literally nothing we could do to stop them. They could launch $1 trillion because of the First Amendment, and like, you cannot put limits on speech. If a nation state wanted to do an overt, massive influence campaign in the United States, as long as they acknowledged that it was them that did it and registered appropriately, legally, we have no ability to stop them. So this is a unique thing in the United States, which is absolutely fascinating. So you bring in the TikTok of it all, right? And now you have the potential for, and remember, ByteDance has significant shareholders, the Chinese army, is the owner of TikTok. One of the things we were talking about is during, like, post 9/11, when the government and national security folks came to Google, Microsoft, Twitter, a number of those companies basically told the United States government to pound sand and come back with a warrant. Some were more cooperative than others, but by and large, their lawyers are like, come back with a warrant, otherwise don't waste our time.
Right.
If you're ByteDance, if you're TikTok in China, and they say, we want you to censor, oppression of the Uyghurs, we want you to censor any mention of Tiananmen Square or other, any of these kinds of things, or Hong Kong, freedom, they just do it, and they have to, because the rules are different in China. You don't have corporations and individuals don't really have that ability to say no to things in the way that we do in the United States. And I think a lot of people just aren't really aware of how different the rules are, and what the nature of the rule of law is.
The thing I find very interesting about this, not so much what China can do to its own population, but the control by the CCP of ByteDance, the influence it has of ByteDance, and then trickles down into TikTok. What I find very interesting is that depending on where you are in the world, a different algorithm is used basically against you, right? To influence and target you on TikTok, which means that China, as a nation state, as a whole, through a corporate entity, can go ahead and just say, everyone in the United States, let's say this, everybody in Illinois, say Illinois is a blue state, okay, predominantly a blue state. Maybe we say that. Maybe we'll pick on somebody in the Northeast.
Chicago.
Let's pick on, and say we're going to target everybody in this geo-fenced area, right? Not even the United States as a whole. We're just going to target this area, and we're going to show you this type of information to incite you, to influence you to vote one way, to curb your thinking, to get you mad about this issue, and show you things that maybe not be happening, but will get you to get, excited enough about it that you're going to do something either at the polls or in the street.
Yeah.
And that part, that's the part that scares me, because not because of the thing that scares me about that is that we are willingly accepting that is happening because we use social media, and we kind of throw our hands up and being like, well, nothing we can do about it.
And honestly, it's questionable to me, and I think this is part of what the Trump administration ran into, is it's really questionable to me what legal powers the federal government has to do something about this, even if they want to. I'd be very curious to see, even if Congress does pass legislation around this, it's very possible ByteDance, et cetera, are willing to appealing all the way to the Supreme Court and winning the same way, the Washington Post and New York Times did with the Pentagon Papers. because
Right.
I think they can very easily, skew it as a question of free speech. You
Freedom of
know,
speech. But does a foreign entity, right? Does a foreign entity have the same right to free speech as a U.S. citizen in the United States?
corporations are people, right? This is a lot of what Citizens United versus whatever. That's a lot of what that's about, is the idea that corporations have speech rights,
Hmm.
as expressed by money, which is how we ended up in the situation we're in. Clearly the founders didn't anticipate corporations, having those kinds of rights, but second and third order unintended consequences.
Here
Here
we
we
are.
are. So it's fascinating. I think it'll be very interesting to see what Congress does about it and what even stands in the courts. But you're absolutely right. The majority. I saw. I didn't read the article, so maybe it's crap. But saying that the majority of 18 to 20, 22-year-olds get the majority of their news
Yeah, no,
through
that's
TikTok.
that. So I did read that. I think it's like, under 30-year-olds, like 10%, 10-12% of them get their news from TikTok. Right. And it's growing.
Terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's, I mean, let's say, for instance, Congress, right, pulls it off and is like, all right, hey, on paper,
Yeah.
outlawed. I mean, I can only think of, this is technology we're talking about, right? So I can only think of like a couple levers to be able to pull on here, right? You've got the Apple and the Google stores. You basically force those two corporations to ban and remove those apps. I don't know, does Windows even have a store anymore
There's
for
a
the
Windows store,
phone?
but
Is there a Windows store? Okay, so we got to get
phone's dead. But they've
Microsoft.
got it from
We got to get Amazon. We basically get whoever has a marketplace and making the TikTok app or access available. Well, let's just start with the app. So you got the app. You take care of the app. You remove the app from being installed. Do you then pull like the reverse, like iTunes with the U2 album, where, like, remember, like, one day everyone's iPod just had U2's latest album on it, and everyone was like, "Wait, companies can do that?"
Yeah.
Right? We're just going to pull a reverse of that. And we're be like, all right, everyone who has an Apple phone, TikTok's now removed from the United States. Okay, one, how are you going to do that? Right? You got to do that on Androids. You got to do that on Apple. But then you still have internet access through web browsers and free reign internet access to view TikTok.
Yeah, but
to view those sites.
a lot fewer people are going to use that, especially among young people.
But push come to shove, right? Junkie needs their junk, right? If you take away the app and people are like, I still want to see my dancing videos and whatever,
they'll migrate to a competitor.
Migrate
if there's
to
much
something.
friction at all, they'll migrate.
Will they migrate to another app that becomes a predominant player, or will they still hold on to the app's influence and find another way to get to that information? I don't know.
Yeah.
But you have to still kind of jump in there and go, well, what can you possibly block? What could you control within that space? And like, the one thing that the US does not have that China does have is the Great Firewall, right? The US has never had an infrastructure where it can actually control in a geographic space or its, sovereignty, any information whatsoever coming in and out our space. Period. Like, we can never do that because we have a free reigning capitalistic society that allows all these different telcos to go
under the First Amendment. It just wouldn't be legal.
And there's no way to even control that. So like, it's almost
it's
like
not built for that.
We could get up to a certain point, but then it's like, well, we're gonna win a couple battles. We're gonna lose the war.
Yeah. It is interesting. I think there'll be more of this, right? I think it's interesting too. I think I was talking to Lauren, and I will say conventional wisdom. I probably shouldn't get too far into that. But what I'll say is that it's interesting because in the United States, the U.S. doesn't really have for-profit entities that are owned by the government, right? We'll charter nonprofits, like the Smithsonian or the Institute for Peace,
right?
Or Broadcasting Board of Governors, but we don't generally. The U.S. government isn't in the for-profit business, ironically, given that we're in the United States. So, and the post office is in like in a weird kind of limbo space because of what it is. But other countries make big investments in like Airbus, and Renault, and like big, even and obviously with China, you got Huawei. who is a massive consumer and business B2B manufacturer doing billions of dollars, tons of business internationally, and it's owned by the Chinese government. It's interesting because like we don't really do that. And the idea of a state investing in a company is something that just doesn't really compute to us. And so,
Does In-Q-Tel and Palantir not count?
well, In-Q-Tel is another one that was spun off. It was chartered and then spun off, right? And so it's not actually owned and operated by the U.S. government. Profits don't go back to the intelligence community.
But I would posture that the Chinese-owned corporations in China are not invested in those companies for economic reasons.
Right.
Right. They're not hoping that the P&L is in their favor and they're going to see a return on their investment. Their return on their investment is not monetary.
Well, I mean,
it's information, it's data, it's control, right. It's access.
But it's also, it's a little tricky, right? Because both China and Russia have oligarchs. Sure. So it is often, you do have the case like in Russia where they basically wholesale, the Soviet Union built massive enterprises and that were owned by all the people, of the commune. Right. And then these like 7 oligarchs basically sold it to themselves for pennies on the dollar and like stole the entire Russian economy. And so, when you have like Gazprom or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, those profits are going back to the state, by which we mean oligarchs and like organized crime people.
That's true.
And there's a smaller level of that. The difference is there are oligarchs in China, but they are still beholden to the party, which didn't happen in Russia. The oligarchs defeated the party.
Right.
So in some cases, those profits are going back to the state and being siphoned off along the way to oligarchs, who have controlling interests. So there is profit definitely as part of it.
Sure.
But you're right about that, like the strategic national interest as well in terms of how you like manipulate those companies. I suspect the Chinese and Russians are very confused by the fact that the U.S. government doesn't have a stake in Northrop Grumman or General Dynamics, or L3. And like, why not? Like that's crazy that your like tanks and your jets and your fighter jets are supplied to you entirely by a private company who could just decide, what's to keep China from coming in and like, and these are publicly traded companies.
Right.
In theory, they could come in and like buy a controlling share of Northrop Grumman and be like, we're not selling jets to the U.S. government anymore.
Right.
Like that, but it's like the fact that that's even like feasible, because of like free trade, is something that I think is very puzzling to other nation states because of how we operate.
I'm sure. So, Lauren, can we ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, what your view on the potential impact of TikTok, is on U.S. national security.
Well, it's hard I don't see it as a threat. Like my experience with TikTok is it's like really a delightful app. It got a lot of people through the pandemic. Like
sure.
People were able to connect and watch, silly videos of their friends dancing. And like anytime there's a hot summer single, like the dance challenges are super fun. Like TikTok is fun. It's one of the funnest places on the internet. But I also like can acknowledge that TikTok, it's not just TikTok that like collects all of the information, right? Like your location and like they have all your data, but so does Twitter and Google and Facebook, Meta, like they all do this, right? And so when I first heard this uproar about TikTok, I'm like, why are we picking on TikTok? Like they all do it, that's the question I have for you guys is like, what is so special about TikTok? Like they all do it.
I think
that's great.
It goes back to what David made the point earlier where, post 9/11, the US government showed up to Google and Facebook and everyone, and they all said, not without a warrant. Like, we don't have to give you any of this information. That is the difference to me with TikTok, because they're owned by ByteDance. ByteDance willingly gives any information over to the state. There is no rhyme or reason. So, and on top of that, you don't have the US government involved inside of Google, influencing Google or directing Google. Hey, build these things, target these people, show this information to these folks when they make this search term. Whereas the CCP can basically tell TikTok, anybody in Alabama will see these videos.
Yeah.
Like they can do that. That's the part that I'm like, ooh.
They do it. If that
But
ever
Twitter
happens,
can too. Like,
what's
to
that?
be clear, Twitter can too. And there are places, right? Like places in the world, hopefully not in the US. Though I don't know, I don't work there anymore. Like they can and do have to make those decisions because of
Right.
governments that are organized like the one you are describing, right? Like
Right.
Right.
they have people that say if you want to do business in Turkey,
Right.
then you will abide by these rules.
You're never gonna mention the Armenian genocide, right?
Right. Right.
Or you're gonna censor that, you know? Yeah, that's
So
true.
so I get like so should I be concerned like a lot of things are made in China, not just TikTok, right? Like my robot vacuum with a camera and like it drives around my house and it's got a camera on it to avoid obstacles. But like, should I be concerned that someone that is employed at the robot vacuum company could like if
So here's what I'll say on that, right? So supply chain operations are real, like that's a thing, right? But those supply so there's two pieces, right? A supply chain operation is where an intelligence service somewhere finds out that someone, let's say Putin's going to buy a new car, right? And and let's say it's going to be a BMW, it's going to be built in Germany,
Mhm.
and a spy from some country infiltrates that factory in Germany and implants a permanent bug inside the car that's going to be Putin's car down the line, right? That's a supply chain operation. That is very different than Huawei saying, we are going to build a backdoor into every single router, every single cell phone, every single cell phone transmission tower that will be installed in Africa. We will build a backdoor so that the Chinese army can go in and just turn it off whenever they want, or or listen in on every packet that's being sent after the fact, right? And this is the difference too between your iPhone, which is designed in Cupertino, built in China, but you can bet your ass when the hardware and the software comes back to the United States that Apple has a process to make sure that there's not a special toy surprise inside, every iPhone that's coming back to the United States. Now, they're not checking every single iPhone, right? But they are checking iPhones writ large, that are coming in. If somehow, if you order a special iPhone and that's going to go to, President Biden or whatever, and that's going to be built in China, like you want to scrub that thing pretty hard because if you're the Chinese, you have an obvious incentive to try and manipulate that before it gets delivered to the target, But there's a big difference between an individual tailored, expensive, and like very time consuming supply chain operation to target a specific target versus saying, we're going to build this into the firmware from scratch and you can't turn it off. You can't bypass it. We built it that way on purpose. And there's reason to suspect that maybe what's going on with Huawei.
I think there is, so I'm not a sky is falling, right, kind of person. I've been pretty straightforward on like things to worry about, realistic things to worry about as a consumer versus a professional. Consumer grade goods, it's just kind of, hey, worst case scenario, they see the layout of my house, right? They spy on me when I walk down to my kitchen one day just wearing my bathrobe, right? Like, is that a concern? Yes, that would suck. I would hate for that to happen. Am I a highly valued target? Am I a high net worth individual? Am I a public official? If they had that information, would it be embarrassing to me? Everyone has to make that decision, and you're going to go, no, like nobody cares.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about Brian Hogley, right?
Yeah.
That's not a thing. There's nothing about that. But I think for those select few people or those groups where, they are adopting technology like that, right? Where, hey, robot cleaners, doorbells, cameras for, closed circuit television, things like that. Those are where you turn on that paranoid, dial and go, okay, hold on. Where we are and what we do, we should be concerned about just buying anything. We should worry about what we're purchasing. And I think that's when you look at what, because we're doing this with we're actually doing this with our own product, Enclave. We're going to get it onto the GSA schedule. We have to go through, and that's where the federal government can purchase products off of an approved list. In order to get our own product right onto that, we have to adhere to and state these products don't use anything from these Chinese companies. These don't use anything from Kaspersky, a Russian company. You have to kind of state that. So the federal government said, hey, here are suppliers that we know. We're just going to make the easy bet and say we don't trust them. Let's just make that easy. So they are thoughtful about that because their paranoia dial is turned appropriately to the right level, which makes them go, hold on, don't just buy anything off the shelf. And that's why when you see DoD or Department of Energy and they're standing up new facilities or even home, they're like, don't just go buy the Linksys router from Best Buy. Yes, we know we sound paranoid, but just let's play it safe. But as a consumer, I'm not really worried about that. You shouldn't be really worried about
the threat's
that.
lower. Yeah.
Right.
I remember, when I left CIA, I briefly worked for a internet freedom fighter nonprofit, which shall remain nameless. It was
There's only like 3.
Yeah,
so,
I know.
Just kidding.
People can figure that out if they want. I'm not trying to stir up trouble, but when they recruited me out and I came and worked for them, and what was interesting was navigating. They had a lot of paranoia. And the thing I came to realize is paranoia is a function of ignorance, right? Because you're paranoid when you don't know who's in the dark or who might be listening to your phone calls or whatever, And it was interesting. I was chatting with one of these folks who were based in DC, and they're like, I think the FBI was in my apartment because I came back and things were moved, and I was like, well, that's how I know it wasn't the FBI. If the FBI was in your apartment, nothing would be moved. They're really good, but it could have been the Syrians, and so you probably should report that to the FBI because if you get Syrians breaking into your house, looking for Syrian dissidents, or the tools that Syrian dissidents are using, your interests are aligned with the FBI in this particular moment, even though you may not trust the government. But it's like when you're an intelligence officer, you're not worried that someone might be listening to your phone calls or reading your emails. Someone's reading your emails and listening to your phone calls because it's their job to do that, and you don't hate the player. And it's this is the job. We're listening to their phone calls and reading their emails too. That's just the deal, And you have a sense of if someone's listening to my phone calls, here's who it is, here's why they're doing it. I understand what their incentives are, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the difference between Google and Amazon having access to my emails and access to my conversations and, Alexa in the home, is because you have to start with the threat modeling and think about who is your adversary and what are their intentions, right? Because Google and Amazon don't have nukes or cops. They don't have the ability to come arrest you and put you in jail, right? It's the combination of motive, means, and opportunity, as opposed to the Russian intelligence service or the Chinese intelligence service, who very much want to try and figure out everything that I know and people I've talked to so that they can find their internal, our Russian or Chinese assets and torture them to death. There are very serious consequences to them listening and finding that information out. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Twitter and Google and Facebook, their intention is to redistribute wealth to their shareholders. That is their whole purpose, redistribute wealth to their shareholders. And their interests are not aligned with leaking my emails to the U.S. government, leaking my emails publicly, leaking my emails to a foreign intelligence service, because if it became known that Google was leaking your email information out there,
that'd be bad for the brand.
It would destroy their stock price.
Right.
So their incentives are actually aligned with mine when it comes to privacy around stuff like that, as opposed to the U.S. government or these foreign intelligence services. Once you've kind of thought about what people's incentives are, then you can kind of threat model.
Yeah, this is we have to break, but this is coincidentally very reminiscent of our Roe v. Wade and the period tracking apps that we discussed a little while ago when it comes to privacy and data and access and who's doing it, who should really be worried about versus who you're not worried about, right? And maybe you should be. So, hey, everybody, thanks for watching another CISO Life. I'm Brian Hoagley. It's brought to you by SideChannel. I want to thank David and Lauren for being my guests today as we are discussing all the fun things around privacy, data aggregation, the Chinese, the Googles, the Apples, and all the other fun stuff. Be safe. We'll check you next time on CISO Life. All right. Take care.